I used to admire how hard Mia worked. She always threw herself into her career with passion and drive, climbing the ladder in ways that made me proud. Her job in marketing wasn't easy, but she thrived in the chaos, balancing deadlines and client meetings with an ease that amazed me. We had a system. She'd come home late from the office, tired but smiling, and we'd talk about our day while sharing a bottle of wine. I'd tell her about the projects I was handling at work, and she'd regale me with funny stories about her coworkers. "It's just me and the team pushing through the big campaign," she'd say, waving off my concerns about her staying late. "You know how it is. Someone's got to pick up the slack." And I did know how it was, or at least I thought I did. At first, I didn't question anything. She'd been staying late for months now, but it was part of the job. Or so she said. I trusted her completely. Mia wasn't the kind of woman to play games or hide things from me. But then the little things started to bother me. One night, she came home later than usual, her hair disheveled, her makeup slightly smudged. I didn't think much of it at first. She'd probably had a stressful evening. But when I leaned in to kiss her, I caught the faintest whiff of cologne on her jacket. "New perfume?" I teased, raising an eyebrow. She froze for a fraction of a second before laughing it off. "One of the guys at work must have hugged me. You know how close we all are." It felt like a reasonable explanation, so I let it go. But as the weeks went on, more little things piled up. Her phone, once casually left on the counter or the nightstand, was now always with her, locked tight. When she texted, she'd angle the screen away, her fingers flying faster than usual. "Mia, everything okay?" I asked one night as we sat on the couch. "Of course," she said, smiling at me. But her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. One night, curiosity got the better of me. While she was in the shower, I picked up her phone from the dresser, my heart pounding as I unlocked it. I wasn't proud of myself, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Her messages seemed normal at first, texts from coworkers, friends, and her mom. But then I saw a thread with a name I didn't recognize, Ethan. The messages weren't incriminating, but they were strange. "Ethan, still thinking about what you said earlier. Mia, let's not talk about it here. Tomorrow at the office." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. Who was Ethan? And why didn't she want to talk about whatever this was over text? I heard the water shut off, and I quickly put the phone back where I'd found it, my mind racing. That night, as Mia lay beside me, her breathing slow and even, I stared at the ceiling, replaying the messages in my head. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe Ethan was just a coworker, and I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But deep down, I knew better. Something was going on, and I was going to find out what. The next morning, Mia left the house like clockwork, kissing me on the cheek and flashing me her usual radiant smile. "Don't forget, I'll be late tonight," she said, grabbing her bag. I nodded, masking the churn of unease in my stomach. As soon as her car pulled out of the driveway, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee cup. The name Ethan played on a loop in my mind, each repetition more insistent than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know who he was, that the answer might unravel everything I thought I knew about Mia. I decided to act. I drove to her office during my lunch break. It wasn't far from where I worked, and I'd been there plenty of times for her company events. Pulling into the lot, I parked a few rows away from the employee entrance, hoping to blend in. My plan wasn't well thought out. I didn't even know what I was looking for. But I figured if there was anything unusual, I'd spot it. The first hour passed uneventfully. Employees filtered in and out, carrying coffees, chatting with coworkers, moving through the motions of their day. But then I saw him, a young guy, probably mid-20s, with slicked back hair and an easy confidence in his stride. He was dressed sharply, his blazer fitted, his shoes polished. He carried himself like someone who knew they were admired. He caught my attention because of how out of place he seemed. The marketing team Mia worked with was older, more seasoned, but this guy stood out. He entered the building without a second glance, and I felt my pulse quicken. I couldn't be sure, but something told me this was Ethan. I waited for Mia to leave that evening. As expected, she was one of the last to walk out, her heels clicking against the pavement. She glanced at her phone as she crossed the lot, her expression focused. A moment later, she smiled. One of those small, private smiles that she used to give me. She wasn't smiling at her phone. She was smiling at him. Ethan stepped out of the building behind her, and they exchanged a few words I couldn't hear. They didn't touch, didn't do anything overt, but the ease between them spoke volumes. He said something that made her laugh, and then they walked to their cars, each going in separate directions. I followed Mia home that night, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced with questions, doubts, and a creeping certainty that I was right to be suspicious. That night, after Mia fell asleep, I opened her laptop. I knew it was wrong, that I was crossing a line, but I couldn't stop myself. Her password was still the same as it had always been, and within seconds, I was in. At first, everything seemed normal. Work emails, project files, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I found a folder tucked away in the corner of her desktop. It was titled Campaign Plans, but when I opened it, the contents were far from professional. Photos of her and Ethan, smiling at a coffee shop, sitting on a bench in the park. One photo showed her leaning in close to him, her hand resting lightly on his knee. My stomach churned as I scrolled through the images, each one confirming what I didn't want to believe. Then I found the emails. Ethan, can't stop thinking about the other night. When can I see you again? Mia, soon. Just be patient. My chest tightened, a wave of nausea hitting me as the reality sank in. This wasn't just a work relationship. This wasn't innocent. I closed the laptop and sat there in the dark, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. My wife, the woman I'd shared my life with for nearly a decade, was having an affair. The next morning, I didn't say a word. I watched her move through her routine as if nothing was wrong, as if she hadn't shattered the foundation of our marriage. When she kissed me goodbye, I barely managed to nod. As soon as she was gone, I picked up my phone and called Tom, my oldest friend. I need to talk, I said, my voice trembling. Come over, he replied without hesitation. I drove to his house, my thoughts spinning in a chaotic loop. By the time I got there, I felt like I was going to explode. Tom opened the door, taking one look at my face before pulling me inside. What happened? He asked, leading me to the couch. I told him everything, the messages, the photos, the moments that had led me to this point. When I finished, he sat back, running a hand through his hair. Mark, he said carefully, you need to figure out what you want to do. You can't keep this to yourself. I know, I said, my voice hollow, but I don't know how to confront her. What if she lies? What if she denies it? Then you need proof she can't argue with, Tom said firmly. You need to catch her in the act. The thought made my stomach churn, but I knew he was right. I couldn't live in limbo, wondering if I was wrong, if I'd misinterpreted the signs. I needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt, and I was going to get it. I spent the next few days in a state of restless anticipation, planning my next move. Tom's advice echoed in my mind. I needed undeniable proof, something that would strip away any chance for Mia to twist the truth or deny what was happening. But I hated the idea of waiting for her to slip up, to catch her in a moment that would shatter everything. I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take, but I knew I had to be patient. That Friday, Mia told me she'd be working late again. Her tone was casual, as if it were just another routine evening at the office. Big presentation on Monday, she said, grabbing her bag. I'll probably be home after 10. I nodded, doing my best to keep my expression neutral. All right, don't work too hard. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and walked out the door. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, I grabbed my jacket and keys. I'd been waiting for this moment, and now it was here. I drove to her office, parking in a shadowed spot across the lot. The building was mostly dark, save for a few lights on the upper floors. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, scanning every car that entered or left. Just after 8 p.m., I saw it. Ethan's car pulling into the lot. He parked near the side entrance and got out, carrying what looked like a bottle of wine. My jaw tightened as I watched him head inside. I waited another 15 minutes before getting out of my car. The air was cool, the silence of the night broken only by the sound of my footsteps as I approached the building. The side door was unlocked, and I slipped inside, my pulse racing. The office was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floor feel deafening. I moved cautiously, staying close to the walls, listening for any sound that might guide me. And then I heard it, a low laugh, muffled but distinct. It was coming from one of the conference rooms at the end of the hall. I crept closer, my breath shallow, every nerve in my body on edge. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and through the gap, I could see the faint glow of candlelight. What I saw next made my stomach twist. Mia was sitting on the edge of the conference table, her legs crossed, a glass of wine in her hand. She was laughing at something Ethan had said, her posture relaxed, her smile radiant. He stood close to her, too close, his hand resting lightly on her knee. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Mia tilted her head, looking up at him with an expression I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't just affection, it was desire. And then she leaned in and kissed him. The sight hit me like a punch to the gut. My hands clenched into fists as I fought the urge to storm in, to tear them apart, to demand answers. But something stopped me, a voice in the back of my mind, telling me to wait. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking, and started recording. The video was grainy in the low light, but it was enough. Enough to capture the betrayal, to prove to myself that this wasn't some misunderstanding or paranoid delusion. They broke apart, laughing softly, and Ethan poured her another glass of wine. "You're too good at this," he said, his voice low. Mia smirked, running her fingers through her hair. "It's all about practice," she replied. I couldn't listen anymore. I turned and walked away, my footsteps silent on the carpet. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. The reality of what I just witnessed was suffocating, but at least now I had what I needed. Back in my car, I sat in silence, the video still open on my phone. My hands shook as I played it back, watching the moment over and over, each time cutting deeper than the last. This was it, the proof I needed. But as I stared at the screen, a new question gnawed at me. What was I going to do now? I spent the entire night staring at the video on my phone. Watching it once was painful enough, but I couldn't stop myself from replaying it. Every detail, the way Mia laughed, the way she leaned into Ethan's touch, burned itself into my memory. By the time the sun rose, I felt like a hollow shell, drained of every ounce of energy and emotion. But I knew what I had to do. When Mia came home the next morning, she looked surprised to see me awake and sitting at the kitchen table. "You're up early," she said, her voice casual as she set her bag down. "Yeah," I replied, my tone flat. "Couldn't sleep." She paused, studying me for a moment, as if sensing something was off. "Everything okay?" "No," I said simply, locking eyes with her. Her smile faltered. "What's wrong?" I pulled out my phone and slid it across the table toward her. "This." Her face paled as she picked up the phone, her fingers trembling slightly. She pressed play, and the color drained from her cheeks as the video played out. When it ended, she set the phone down slowly, her eyes wide with shock. "Mark, I can explain," she started, her voice shaky. "Explain?" I snapped, my voice rising. "Explain what, Mia? That you've been sneaking around with your intern? That you've been lying to me for months? That you've destroyed everything we've built together?" She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "Don't bother. I've heard enough. I saw enough." Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached across the table. "Mark, please. It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I interrupted, my anger boiling over. "I saw you, Mia. I saw everything. Do you have any idea what it felt like to stand there and watch you throw away our marriage for him?" She broke down then, covering her face with her hands as sobs racked her body. "I'm so sorry," she choked out. "I never meant for it to go this far." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Never meant for it to go this far? So what, Mia? A kiss would have been fine? A few stolen moments? Where do you draw the line? She didn't answer, her sobs filling the silence between us. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at her, trying to reconcile the woman in front of me with the one I thought I knew. But the more I looked, the more I realized I couldn't do it. "I trusted you," I said finally, my voice quiet but laced with pain. "I loved you. And this is how you repay me? She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face a mask of regret. Mark, I made a mistake. A horrible, unforgivable mistake. But please, don't let this be the end of us. I shook my head, stepping away from the table. It was the end the moment you decided to betray me, I said coldly. There's nothing left to save, Mia. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw her for what she really was, broken, desperate, and clinging to something that was already gone. I'll be staying somewhere else for now, I said, grabbing my keys. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the divorce. Her head shot up, panic flashing in her eyes. Mark, no. Please don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, anything. Just don't give up on us. I paused at the door, turning to look at her one last time. You gave up on us the moment you let him into your life, I said, my voice firm. This is on you, Mia, not me. And with that, I walked out, leaving her sobbing in the kitchen. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. Driving aimlessly through the city, I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The lies, the betrayal, the pain. It all felt like too much to bear. Eventually, I ended up at Tom's house. He opened the door, his expression grim when he saw me. You told her, he asked. I nodded, my throat tight. It's over, I said simply. Tom didn't press for details. He just nodded and stepped aside, letting me in. That night, as I lay on his couch staring at the ceiling, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, sadness, anger, and a flicker of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. The days after I left Mia were a blur. I moved into Tom's spare room, trading the familiar comforts of home for a mattress on the floor and a borrowed blanket. It wasn't much, but it was enough. At least here, I didn't have to walk through the halls of a house filled with memories of her. Tom did his best to keep my spirits up. He cracked jokes, forced me out for runs, and made sure the fridge was stocked with beer. But there was only so much he could do. The betrayal cut deep, and no amount of distractions could make me forget the image of Mia and Ethan in that conference room. I threw myself into work, hoping that the grind would numb the pain. It didn't. Every moment I wasn't busy, my mind wandered back to her, to us. I replayed every argument, every late night, every excuse she'd given me. The signs had been there all along, but I'd been too blind to see them. One evening, as I sat in Tom's living room staring blankly at the TV, he plopped down beside me and handed me a beer. You can't live like this forever, he said, his tone blunt but not unkind. I sighed, taking a long sip. What do you want me to do, Tom? Pretend everything's fine? It's not. No, but wallowing in it won't change anything, he said, leaning back in his chair. You've got a choice here, Mark. You can let this destroy you, or you can take it as a chance to start over. His words stuck with me. Starting over felt impossible, but what other option did I have? I couldn't go back, and I couldn't stay where I was. The next day, I met with my lawyer. Sitting in her office, going over the details of the divorce, felt surreal. She asked about assets, accounts, and custody arrangements. I answered her questions mechanically, my mind still caught in the whirlwind of everything that had happened. You're entitled to more than you think, she said, glancing over the documents. Given the circumstances, you have a strong case for a favorable settlement. I nodded, though the thought of fighting over money or property felt exhausting. All I wanted was to be done with it. But as the weeks passed, something shifted. I stopped waking up with a pit in my stomach. I started running again, hitting the trails early in the morning when the world was still quiet. I found a new rhythm, one that didn't revolve around Mia or the life we'd shared. One night, Tom dragged me out to a bar, insisting I needed to rejoin the land of the living. I wasn't in the mood, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. You've been moping around long enough, he said, handing me a beer as we sat at the bar. The place was loud and crowded, filled with the kind of energy I hadn't felt in months. At first, I just nursed my drink, letting the noise wash over me. But then a woman approached me, a stranger with kind eyes and an easy smile. Mind if I sit here? She asked, gesturing to the empty stool beside me. Go ahead, I said, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. We started talking, about nothing important at first, just small talk about the weather and the music playing in the background. But as the night went on, the conversation deepened. She told me about her job, her travels, her love of hiking. I told her about my own hobbies, carefully skirting around the topic of my recent heartbreak. By the time the bar closed, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter. The pain was still there, but it didn't feel as suffocating. I realized then that Tom was right. I couldn't let this destroy me. I didn't call the woman from the bar right away, but the thought of her lingered in my mind. She was a reminder that there was still life beyond the wreckage of my marriage. Over the next few weeks, I started piecing my life back together. I found a small apartment on the other side of town, nothing fancy but enough to call my own. I started cooking again, filling the space with the smell of roasted chicken and fresh herbs. Therapy became a lifeline. I met with Dr. Patel once a week, spilling out all the anger, sadness, and confusion I'd been holding inside. She listened patiently, offering insights that helped me make sense of the chaos. "It's okay to grieve," she said during one session, "but don't let the grief define you. You're more than what happened to you, Mark." Her words stayed with me. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the sunset with a cup of coffee in hand, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of dramatic closure you see in movies. There was no epiphany, no sudden moment of clarity, but it was enough. I was moving forward, one step at a time. The days continued to pass, and with each one, I felt more like myself. My apartment was modest, but it was starting to feel like home. The bare walls now had art on them, prints I'd picked out on a whim, things that spoke to me in a way nothing had in months. The bookshelves I'd built were filled with novels I hadn't touched in years, and the small balcony became my favorite spot to sit and think, especially at dusk when the world turned quiet. I'd gotten into a routine that felt good, even grounding. Work was no longer just a distraction, but something I poured myself into with purpose. My colleagues noticed the shift, and so did my boss. The promotion that had been put on hold during the chaos of my personal life was finally back on the table. "Mark," my boss said one afternoon after a long meeting, "I've been watching you these past few months. You're focused, driven. I want you to take the lead on the next big project. You've earned it." Hearing those words felt like a validation I hadn't known I needed. For so long, I'd been defined by the wreckage of my marriage. But now, I was building something of my own. Outside of work, things were slowly shifting too. Tom continued to be the unwavering presence he'd always been, showing up with beers and unsolicited advice. But he wasn't the only one. I'd kept the phone number of the woman I met at the bar, Natalie. It had been weeks since that night, and I wasn't sure if calling her was the right move. But one evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the city lights flicker to life, I found myself dialing her number. "Hello." Her voice came through the phone, warm and familiar. "Hey, it's Mark," I said, my heart pounding just a little. "Mark," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I was wondering if you'd call." We talked for nearly an hour that night, our conversation flowing as easily as it had when we met. She told me about her week, her plans for the weekend, and somewhere along the line, I asked her out for coffee. "Coffee sounds perfect," she said. That weekend, we met at a small cafe tucked away in a quiet part of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy, and it felt right. We sat by the window, the late morning sun streaming in as we talked about everything and nothing. She had a way of making me laugh, of putting me at ease in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't forced or complicated. It was simple. As we said goodbye, she looked at me and said, "You seem like a good guy, Mark. I'd like to see you again." I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in months. "I'd like that too." Over the next few weeks, Natalie and I saw each other more often. It wasn't some whirlwind romance. It was slow, steady, and exactly what I needed. She didn't push me to open up about my past, but when I did, she listened without judgment. "You've been through a lot," she said one evening as we walked through the park, "but you're still standing. That says a lot about who you are." Her words stuck with me. At the same time, I was focusing on rebuilding my relationship with my kids. They were young, too young to fully understand what had happened, but they were resilient. I made sure to be present for them in every way I could, picking them up from school, helping with their homework, and spending weekends building pillow forts and watching movies. One night, as I tucked my daughter into bed, she looked up at me and said, "Daddy, are you happy now?" The question caught me off guard, but I nodded. "I think I am, sweetheart," I said. She smiled, her small hand reaching for mine. "I'm glad." Those words stayed with me long after she'd fallen asleep. They reminded me of why I was doing all of this, why I was fighting to move forward, to rebuild, to find peace. It wasn't just for me. It was for them. One evening, as I sat on the balcony with Natalie, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she turned to me and said, "You seem different." "Different how?" I asked, curious. "Lighter," she said with a smile. "Like you're finally letting go of the past." I thought about her words, about everything I'd been through, and realized she was right. The weight that had once felt so suffocating was finally lifting. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The small moments like that reminded me of what it felt like to be truly seen and appreciated. With Natalie, there were no games, no secrets, no lies. She was open, honest, and refreshingly real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. Outside of my relationship with Natalie, other parts of my life were flourishing too. Work had become more fulfilling than I ever thought it could be. The big project my boss had trusted me with was a success, and with it came a level of recognition I hadn't experienced before. My coworkers congratulated me, my boss shook my hand, and I finally felt like I was building something meaningful, something I could be proud of. But the most rewarding part of my life was still my kids. Every moment I spent with them felt like a gift, a chance to remind them that no matter what had happened, they were my priority. One weekend, we spent an entire Saturday building a treehouse in the backyard of my new place. It wasn't perfect, the boards were crooked, and the paint job was uneven, but the kids loved it. "This is the best treehouse ever, Dad," my son said. His face lit up with excitement. Hearing that made every splinter and sore muscle worth it. Even though life was moving forward, I still had moments when the past crept in. There were nights when I'd wake up from a dream about Mia, the memories of her betrayal still fresh and raw. But those moments didn't consume me like they used to. They were just reminders of where I'd been, not where I was going. One day, I got a call from Mia. It had been months since we'd spoken, and hearing her voice on the other end of the line felt strange. "Mark," she said hesitantly, "I was wondering if we could talk." I hesitated, unsure of what she could possibly have to say. "About what?" "About us," she said softly. "About everything." There was a time when I would have jumped at the chance to have that conversation, to hear her side of things, to try and make sense of what had happened. But now, I realized I didn't need it. "There's nothing to talk about, Mia," I said calmly. "It's over." She was quiet for a moment before sighing. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." "Okay," I said simply. "I appreciate that." And I did. Her apology didn't change anything, but it felt like the final piece of closure I needed to move on completely. That evening, as I sat on the balcony with Natalie, watching the sunset, she turned to me and said, "You seem at peace." "I think I am," I replied, realizing the truth in my words. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared entirely, but it no longer defined me. I had built a new life, a life filled with love, purpose, and hope. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace whatever the future had in store. The past year felt like a lifetime and a blink at the same time. Sitting in my living room on a quiet Sunday morning, the kids laughing in the treehouse outside, Natalie sitting cross-legged on the couch with her nose in a book, I realized how much my life had changed and how much of it I had rebuilt from the ground up. It hadn't been easy. There were days when I doubted myself, when the weight of everything I'd been through threatened to pull me back down. But every step forward, no matter how small, reminded me that I wasn't stuck in the past anymore. The divorce had been finalized months ago. Mia and I had split our assets fairly, and while she had tried to reach out a few more times, I made it clear that there was no room for her in my life anymore. Whatever connection we'd once had was gone, replaced by a cautious, distant civility for the sake of the kids. One evening, Natalie and I were sitting on the balcony, sipping wine as the sun dipped below the horizon. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked, her voice soft. "What do you mean?" I asked, glancing over at her. "For us," she said, setting her glass down. I thought about her question for a moment, about everything we'd shared in the past few months. Natalie had been my anchor in ways I hadn't expected, her kindness and patience helping me find my way back to myself. She wasn't just a part of my life now. She was someone I wanted to build a future with. "I do," I said finally, "and I like what I see." Her smile was warm and genuine, and in that moment, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. Life wasn't perfect. It was messy and complicated, full of challenges and unexpected twists, but it was mine, and I had learned to embrace it, flaws and all. As the kids called out from the yard, Natalie and I stood up, heading downstairs to join them. We spent the evening playing tag in the grass, laughing until our sides hurt, the kind of joy that made everything else fade away. The scars of the past were still there, faint reminders of what I'd endured, but they no longer defined me. I was stronger now, more resilient, and ready for whatever came next. The future was unwritten, but for the first time in a long time, I felt excited to write it.